Hi, and welcome to iWizard. Today we're going to be talking about the all-time great science fiction novel Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. This is a philosophical novel. It's really a thinker. I'm excited to get into it. Stay tuned. All right, Jordan here. So let's get started with a little bit of a summary of this book that I put together for you. As always, please remember to subscribe, and here it goes. Solaris is set in the future when humanity has traveled across the vast reaches of interstellar space and discovered many planets and worlds sustaining life, studying them each in great detail. Yet one planet has long boggled the minds of scientists, that of Solaris. There is life on Solaris, but not the kind that human beings are used to seeing. Solaris is almost completely covered with an ocean of gel that is revealed to be a single, planet-encompassing entity, an immense, monstrously grown, jelly-like fluid cell extending across the entire globe. In other words, the ocean is alive. But what does that mean? How is it alive? Is it intelligent? Is it conscious? At first, scientists are reluctant to visit the planet since it's in a binary star system, and planets that orbit binary stars tend to be bad at harboring life because their orbits are constantly changing and expanding as the planet comes too close then moves too far from the sun's, causing wild fluctuations. But oddly, Solaris doesn't follow this predictable orbit. Once scientists begin studying the planet, they realize this is because Solaris has the incredible ability to control its own orbit, which leads them to believe this planet is very intelligent indeed. So a team is sent out to study Solaris more closely and to communicate with it. Physicists discover a relationship between processes in this plasmic ocean and local measurements of gravitational potential, which change depending on the ocean's metabolic rate. Researchers begin to wonder, is this a biological or a geological entity? How can a syrupy jelly stabilize the orbit of a celestial body? For hundreds of years, scientists study this fascinating planet, attempting to communicate with it, but they're unable to arrive at conclusive results. A field known as solaristics has emerged, but after observing, recording, and categorizing the complex phenomena that occur on the surface of the ocean, the science ultimately fails to produce any tangible results. Nobody's been able to make sense of Solaris or find a conclusive pattern. As the years go by, the results are meager, and less funding is devoted to studying this inscrutable planet. This is where we're at when the book begins, and our protagonist, Chris Kelvin, a psychologist, has been sent to join the ragtag crew of Solaris Station, a research station hovering near the surface of Solaris that harbors the last remaining scientists attempting to discover this planet's secrets. But there is trouble on Solaris Station. Shortly before Kelvin's arrival, the crew, getting desperate, decides to expose the ocean to a more aggressive and unauthorized experiment using high-energy X-ray bombardments. Their experimentation has unexpected results. The ocean, it turns out, has plans of its own. Plans for the crew of Solaris Station. What follows is part journey of wonder, part psychological nightmare, as Chris Kelvin is confronted with a mystery even more inscrutable than Solaris's ocean. Himself. In the end, Solaris prompts the question, can we understand the universe around us without first understanding what lies within? Okay, so that was just a little bit of a synopsis there for you that I put together. I'd like to start by establishing some context here. Solaris was written by the great Polish sci-fi writer Stanislaw Lem, one of the best-selling sci-fi authors of all time. It was originally published in 1961, but was then translated into English in 1970. At this point, it's been adapted to film twice. The first being Andrei Tarkovsky's artsy 2 hour and 40-minute long 1972 version that was actually made in the Soviet Union. I couldn't sit through it, sorry. People say it's a great film, I guess, but it was just kind of too slow for me, and the budget and special effects just weren't good enough, I think, for a sci-fi story like this. And then it was adapted again in 2002 by the director Steven Soderbergh, and it was produced by James Cameron, actually. And while I would say this version succeeds where Tarkovsky's version fails, I think it also kind of fails where Tarkovsky's succeeds. So I would say the special effects, the cinematography, the ship, and all of that stuff is fine. In Soderbergh's version, it's good, but I would say that it's missing the philosophy. It's missing the psychological tension. It focuses very heavily on the love story between Rhea and Kelvin. You get lots of shots of George Clooney being super existential and staring out into space and staring at his hands without really any of the depth and the moral questioning, certainly of Lem's novel, but even of the Tarkovsky version. So, and I would say too, if you're Soderbergh, I don't know why you would choose an actor like George Clooney for a film like this. George Clooney is great when it comes to being dapper and smooth and kind of flippant. And he's good at things like Ocean's 11, but I don't really know why you'd pick him to be this very philosophical, introspective, reflective main character. So I really don't know what they were thinking there. So getting back to the novel, I just have to say, full disclosure, that Solaris is one of the best science fiction novels I've ever read. If you like philosophical sci-fi, this slim little book is definitely a must-read. It's not too long. It's got that brevity. You can read it in a few days. I know not everyone really loves deeply philosophical works of science fiction. I actually majored in philosophy in college, so this book was super accessible to me. Some of my professors had actually recommended it, I remember. But it's not going to be, I guess, accessible to absolutely everyone. Although I will say I'm teaching this book right now and my students are totally into it and they're like high school seniors. So I think if you haven't learned about Descartes, Kant, existentialism, Freud, some of these other Western thinkers, it's not really necessary. It might help you get a little bit more out of the book. It certainly did that for me. But ultimately, you're still going to find the philosophical aspect fascinating, even if some of it ends up going over your head. So, just buckle up, go along for the ride. But I guess I would say if you're more of a military sci-fi person or sort of a whiz-bang, old school L. Ron Hubbard, Edgar Rice Burroughs type of person, you may find that this book is not completely to your taste, but if you like thought-provoking, philosophical, big idea science fiction, I think you'll certainly enjoy this book. So without any further ado, I want to get more into what I liked about this book and what I didn't, because there's a lot here to talk about. This review is going to be, as always, mostly non-spoiler. So let's get into what I liked. First of all, like many other Contact novels, this story is about the fundamental futility of attempting to communicate with extraterrestrial life. What happens when the alien you encounter is so utterly unlike you that you're not able to communicate with it in any meaningful way? And I promise I'm not giving much away here. You learn this in like the second chapter of the book, that what this planet does is that when you probe into Solaris, when you come close to it and start messing around with it, the ocean exposes you to your inner psychology, those hidden aspects of your mind and personality that Freud talked about, obviously. And it does this in the most amazing way that you can possibly imagine. And at the same time, it makes it fairly impossible for you to learn anything about it in return. So imagine trying to communicate with a creature or an alien intelligence that can understand you, but you can't understand it. All human efforts to make sense of Solaris's activities have proven futile, and scientists have been studying Solaris for hundreds of years, and they still can't really get a read completely on what Solaris is all about. And this was definitely part of the design for Stanislaw Lem. As Lem himself put it, the peculiarity of those phenomena seems to suggest that we observe a kind of rational activity, but the meaning of this seemingly rational activity of the Solarian ocean is beyond the reach of human beings. He also wrote that he deliberately chose to make the sentient alien actually not very human-like, and to make it instead an ocean, to avoid the pitfalls that you see in a lot of sci-fi writing of anthropomorphism, of depicting first contact and having your aliens basically just be human beings with different looking eyes and a bigger head and a smaller body or something like that. And it's funny, actually. I wanted to mention that one of my favorite space opera books is Revelation Space by the great sci-fi writer and former astrophysicist Alastair Reynolds. And the main character in that book, Dan Sylvestre, comes into contact with a sentient planet-wide ocean. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's so creative, that's so original. How did he think of that? This ocean in Revelation Space, if you enter it, it uploads your consciousness and preserves your mind in this neural network. And I said, wow, that's really cool. But it turns out that he basically borrowed this idea from Stanislaw Lem, and I hadn't read this book at the time, and so I didn't know that, and so I thought it was totally original when he was just kind of cribbing respectfully from Stanislaw Lem. Speaking of, I want to mention how cool this alien life form is here. In the book, it's described as a, quote, protoplasmic sea brain grown so vast it covers an entire planet. Basically, what this intelligent ocean does is that when you get near it, it's able to penetrate your mind and dig up your buried memories and your repressed traumas and all that stuff that you have pushed down, and then it kind of confronts you with them. It does this by manifesting physical simulacra, including human ones. And so in Kelvin's case, because he's feeling so much guilt about his dead wife, Rhea, the woman he loved and who committed suicide after Kelvin left her, she is the one that materializes for him when he goes out there and makes contact with Solaris. And it's cool because initially when you're reading the first couple of chapters, you're like, oh, that's cool. You know, Solaris kind of psychoanalyzes you and forces you to confront your demons and your feelings and your regrets by making you see things and hallucinate. No, it's actually way more than that. Kelvin is not just seeing things. He's not just hallucinating or dreaming about Rhea. Solaris is basically reaching into his mind and reconstructing a physical copy of her that comes from all the memories and deep feelings that he has about her. And yet, obviously, the new Rhea is not the real Rhea, which is one of the things that makes Solaris such a creepy story. In fact, although the new Rhea looks and feels utterly real to Kelvin in every way, the new Rhea is not actually human. The Solaris planet cannot make another human, not at all. It's this strange alien copy that the planet creates out of its own materials. And Kelvin realizes that everyone else on the station, too, has their own version of Rhea, their own visitors. Lem calls them visitors in the story because it's hard to think of another name for them. And so everyone on the station has their own little person that the planet makes for them. And basically that's the planet's way of kind of interrogating your psyche, which is why Kelvin is actually sent there, because Chris Kelvin is a psychologist. He's basically there for the same reason that the psychologist in Michael Crichton's Sphere is sent down deep in the ocean to analyze this alien ship that's been buried under the ocean for a really long time. Kelvin is there because he's the expert, and the other crew members are basically going mad. So it's interesting that Kelvin is sent out there to figure out this psychological mystery, to help the crew members of Solaris Station. And when he gets there, the same exact thing happens to him. And so the big question here is, what will Chris Kelvin do when he arrives at Solaris Station and his dead wife appears to him out of nowhere? Will he decide that she repulses him because she's alien and strange and other to him? Will he be afraid of her? Will he lose his mind like everyone else? or will he fall in love with her? And can you fall in love with something that isn't real? Or is she real? What makes her not real? Or because she comes from his mind, is she just a manifestation of Kelvin's guilt, of his doubts, of his feelings and his insecurities over what happened to his late wife? And the other question is, why has she been sent? Why is Solaris doing this? Is this a gift? Is Solaris being kind and bringing people a gift? Is Solaris returning Kelvin his dead wife? Or is she simply a way of teaching Kelvin about himself? Is this alien entity so advanced that it's trying to figure out a way of teaching human beings something in a way that they can understand? Is this fundamentally how Solaris communicates with explorers that try to uncover its secrets? And I love this theme, too, that runs throughout the book of the way our minds construct versions of people that are not actually the real person, and that we construct versions of people in the image of ourselves. That's what we do as human beings. One of the scientists on the station, a guy named Snow, actually tells Kelvin that even though we're always trying to explore as human beings, push boundaries, push beyond our world to colonize and seek new worlds, ultimately humans, quote, have no need of other worlds. What we need, even though we may not realize it, is mirrors. And so that's a quote from Snow there. What we always want, Snow is saying, when we search out the other, when we search out extraterrestrial life, what we're actually looking for is ourselves in the end. And he says, in fact, that the purpose of Solaris is to allow us to, quote, observe through a microscope, as it were, our own monstrous ugliness, our folly, our shame. And I love this because Lem then applies this to Chris Kelvin and Rhea and makes it really literal. When we love someone, do we really love the person in this selfless way like we think we do? Or do we love how they make us feel about ourselves? Do we love how they mirror us to ourselves? In the case of Rhea, for Kelvin, this woman, this creature, this visitor or whatever, is a literal product of Kelvin's mind. And he begins to realize that she's different from the real Rhea in some really interesting psychological ways. It's almost as if she is what he needs her to be. In fact, at one point when Rhea herself comes to terms with what she really is, for much of the book, she doesn't actually know where she comes from, that she's a product of the union between Kelvin's mind and this planet. Once he comes clean with her about that, she says, quote, I am not a human being, only an instrument to study your reactions. And yet, Kelvin, I'm giving a little bit away here, so turn away for a second if you think that this will be a spoiler for you. Kelvin can't help but love her. And then I would say, to extrapolate from that, here's the horrifying question. Does it even matter? Does it matter if she isn't real, if he truly does love her? What does it mean to be real? That's another question this book asks, right? So if you love someone and you really and truly love them with all your heart, and you find out that they're an alien creation, heck, maybe you decide realness is overrated. So anyways, all of this is a long-winded way of saying that this book is a great example of that turn during the period in sci-fi known as the New Wave of science fiction, basically going from the exploration of outer space, the cosmos, different planets, different galaxies, to inner space, to an examination of the space between our ears, that space inside that is so hard to analyze and reckon with. Because again, one of the mind-blowing, thought-provoking aspects of this story is that it deals with both the futility of understanding that which is completely alien, that which is other from us and outside of our ability to comprehend, and even more so, the futility of attempting to truly and honestly understand ourselves. So this book examines the intractable problem of studying consciousness, because it turns out you have to use consciousness in order to study your own consciousness. And that's impossible. So can we ever truly know ourselves? It's impossible to turn your eyeballs around and stare at your own eyes, which is why, of course, as Snow points out, we need mirrors. And Solaris, and this is I think, why the book is so truly mind-bending. Solaris, the planet, is like a mirror that allows you to see who you really are. Not the whites of your eyes, but your soul. And then there's the question of, how do you know when a being like Solaris is intelligent? How do you measure that? Solaris is doing all of this extremely sophisticated stuff, but is there a pattern to it? And can scientists find that pattern and make sense of it? Or are its transformations, its syntheses, its behaviors, is it all just random nonsense? When you go down into the planet and you skim over its ocean to study it, Solaris spawns these shapes. It produces these weird geological looking structures, these disks and canyons and vortexes and rapidos, even these crude representations of the things in the explorers' minds when they go down into the planet. They call these things mimoids. And so if this stuff is random, if these manifestations are random, does that mean that Solaris doesn't have a will or a purpose? If it doesn't have a will, is it conscious? Can something be intelligent without being conscious? And how do you know? What if this thing is so intelligent that there's a pattern, but that pattern is just way too complicated for us to understand? So I love that the book explores the limitations of the human mind, the limitations of our science, that in order to understand something, our approach has to be calibrated properly. But what if we don't have the right sensory faculties to even understand something like Solaris? What if our brains are just too small? What if we're just not smart enough? What if understanding Solaris is like fitting a square peg into a round hole, right? So it examines our human limitations, and I think that tends to produce anxiety and dread, and it tends to scare people. Really enjoyed, too, the meditation on how scientists eventually develop a religion around Solaris, and how it's kind of impossible not to, right? As human beings, we worship things, we anthropomorphize whatever we're studying, we make gods out of things, and so we tend to think that our scientists are the most rational people in the world, the least susceptible to ideological corruption or religious impulses. And it turns out that scientists are just as religious as everyone else. And some of them turn Solaris into a kind of god, into a religion. And you see a long meditation on that toward the end of the book. I also want to talk about the element of horror and foreboding in this book. This is something a lot of my students mentioned that is really kind of creepy and powerful. I won't give spoilers here, but there are some really creepy things about the other members of the crew on Solaris Station, and there are definitely a lot of creepy things about the visitors that you'll just have to read this book for yourself to find out. There's also the fact that most of this book takes place on a space station next to a creepy, strange, ununderstandable alien planet that has control over you. And then there's also the aspect of psychological horror. And I wanted to read a quote here that's not too long. It's by Kelvin's station mate, Snow. He says, "Certain events which have actually happened are horrible. But what is more horrible still is what hasn't happened, what has never existed. A normal man, what is a normal man? A man who has never committed a disgraceful act? Maybe. But has he never had uncontrollable thoughts? Well, perhaps he hasn't. But perhaps something, a phantasm, rose up from somewhere within him 10 or 30 years ago, something which he suppressed and then forgot about, which he doesn't fear since he knows he'll never allow it to develop and so lead to any action on his part. And now, suddenly, in broad daylight, he comes across this thing, this thought, embodied, riveted to him, indestructible. He wonders where he is. Do you know where he is? He is here on Solaris." So that's a great quote. And the reason I wanted to read it to you is because one of the creepiest aspects of this book is We repress things for a reason. We push things down for a reason. We have all of these defense mechanisms. We repress things that are traumatic to us. When we have an ugly thought about someone or about the world, we tend to push it down, not acknowledge it, not linger on it too long. And here you're brought to a station outside of this creepy alien planet, Solaris, that is taking your deepest thoughts and repressed traumas and buried memories and impulses and desires, and it is manifesting them physically and placing those things in front of you and confronting you with it. So all of that is good stuff. Definitely a creepy, claustrophobic novel. But I would say, just to close it out here with what I liked, in the end, the moral lesson that Lem communicates that I think is very powerful is that even when we have suffered great loss, as Kelvin has, even when life seems futile and when our vain attempts to seek meaning and our strivings, even when it all seems futile, as human beings, we never cease to hope. We never cease to believe that there's something better out there. In fact, Kelvin leaves us with what I think are some of the best final lines in any novel I've ever read. And so I guess I'll give you a spoiler alert here that if you don't want to hear the last lines of the book and you think this will ruin something for you, plug your ears now, because this is these are the final words in the entire novel. So spoiler alert, okay? The book ends with a little meditation, and Kelvin says, "The time of cruel wonders is not yet over. The time of cruel wonders is not yet over." What a brilliant way to wrap up a novel. Great final lines. People always talk about books, the best first lines in a novel. You can go online and find lists of the books that have the best first lines. I would say the time of cruel wonders is not yet over. I would say that's definitely the best final sentence of any novel I've ever read. But ultimately, I think that this book is about, it's asking this question of who are we, what are we searching for, and why are we searching for it? Okay, so let's talk about what I didn't like. There's not a lot here that I didn't like. Just a couple of things that aren't too major. There were quite a few info dumps in this book. I would have liked for a lot of the world building to have been done in a more elegant fashion. I would have liked for it to be more equitably sprinkled throughout the novel rather than seeing all of these info dumps. There are chapters where like the entire chapter is an info dump where the main character goes into the library on Solaris Station and starts reading books, and then you get snippets of the books that he's reading, and that is supposed to give you the history of Solaris and research into Solaris and the history of solaristics and all the scientists who have worked on it and everything about how the planet works. A lot of that is info dumpy. It would have been better if we could have gone on a journey to Solaris with the main characters of the book. I think that only happens once. Actually, there are a bunch of journeys you take to Solaris, but they're communicated to you through the books that Kelvin is reading and judicial transcripts from political hearings and things like that, and notes and papers and things like that, and conversations, but you never get really that much of a live action exploration of this really amazing planet. It's all there's a lot of exposition. And so that's one thing I think that could have been improved. Now, the good thing is that this isn't a very long novel. And so there's a lot of character development, a lot of character building. So you're not just swamped the entire time with info dumps. But when you learn about Solaris in this novel, you're oftentimes getting a giant info dump. I would say too, and this might not even be a problem, this may have been the point, this is a very claustrophobic novel. Too much of it, I would say, and again, this is going off of what I just said, too much of it takes place on the actual space station. I tend to like a bit more adventure, more movement, more exploration, more world building that is kind of spaced out, where you actually get to learn about the world by traveling around in it a little bit. And so that's kind of what I like in my science fiction. This is a very claustrophobic novel. You're stuck on this space station with a bunch of people who are going crazy, and it's got this definitely has this Kafka-esque quality to it. It's definitely got this. There are times when the conversations between Kelvin and Snow feel like a Samuel Beckett play or something like that. Another thing that might be difficult for some readers, but I actually quite liked it, a lot of made-up words, neologisms, jargon words. And one of the reasons that Lem does this, and Lem is famous for doing this, is because human beings really have no language with which to describe Solaris and all of the weird things that happen on this planet, the strange transformations and metamorphoses. So it's really interesting. He uses a lot of strange jargon words. You might have to sit next to this book with a dictionary a little bit, and you'll find actually that the words he's using are not in the dictionary, and you're really not quite sure what some of them mean. Let me just say too, the edition that I'm holding up here is not the edition that I would say to read. I thought this one was cool looking. It was really cool looking, so I wanted to use this for the video. But there's actually a better translation of Solaris, and it's if you go on, Barnes & Noble or Amazon, this is the paperback version that you'll see if you go to buy a paperback version, and that sort of thing. And the edition that I would say that is the best that I'm using to teach the book and that you'll want to get is you'll want to go with the Joanna Kilmartin and Steve Cox translation of Solaris. I believe that's translated from the French, which was originally translated from the Polish, if I have that right. I think that's right. Anyhow, thank you for watching. I hope you go out and pick up a copy of this, one of the all-time great science fiction novels of all time. It's a slim volume. You'll get through it pretty quickly, and I think you'll really enjoy it if you like yourself some philosophical science fiction. So as always, remember, please subscribe to this channel. Get in touch with me on Goodreads, on Facebook. Feel free to donate to my Patreon. Support a starving artist. Well, I'm not starving, but I would appreciate your support so that we can keep this channel going, upgrade the equipment, and do all of that stuff that we want to do. So until next time, happy reading, and I'll talk to you soon.